Hello, my name is İlknur SAVAŞKAN and I'm attending from Bursa Uludağ University, and my presentation is called Rethinking Translation Techniques and Strategies Applied when Translating from English to Turkish. I thank you for attending this session, and I hope you will find it to be fruitful and helpful. Thank you very much once again. Now, to begin with, the act of translation, due to its nature, adheres to linguistic and cultural transference. Now, however, at times, the translator faces the thorny problems of rendering meaning within the transference process. The nature of the transference of meaning at first necessitates the translator to analyze and evaluate the linguistic meaning which is encoded in the source language, and then to restructure and recode this meaning within the process of transference to the target language. Now, within this process, in order to reach the most appropriate or intended equivalence in the target language, it is possible for the translator to apply translation techniques and various strategies which will help him to recreate the meaning and achieve the intended equivalence. Now, in this dimension of translation, prominent translation theorists and researchers have provided certain terminologies and taxonomies relating to translation techniques and strategies. And the aim of the present study is to investigate and provide examples of how translation techniques and strategies based on context and text function can be applied by the translator when translating from English to Turkish. Now, despite the point that there is a lack of agreement and confusion among translating scholars relating to specifically defining the concepts and the translation techniques, the aim of the present study is to present a category of translation techniques and strategies which were adapted by those classified by prominent researchers such as Vinay and Darbelet, Wetzger, Neider, and Dilar. Now, first of all, I would like to talk about translation strategies. Now, strategies are the conscious verbal or non-verbal procedures which are employed by the translator in order to solve the problems which arise when conducting a translation. Now, these strategies can be used to comprehend the main or the supporting ideas, or to look for specific information while decoding the source text. And then the translator has to recode this meaning in the target text. The translator can do this by paraphrasing or even by omitting or adding words. Now, here it must be noted that paraphrasing can also be considered as a technique. Although we just said it was a strategy, it can be also used as a technique because researchers such as Molina and Albert claim that paraphrasing can be used to solve problems in the translation process, and it can be used as an amplification technique in translation. For example, if there is a cultural word, this can be paraphrased in order to make it understandable to the target text reader. The other point is techniques, okay, translation techniques. Now, when we are talking about techniques, what we mean is the result of procedures, the result of the procedures of a choice made by the translator in order to fulfill a specific function. Now, however, at this point, it must be noted that the translation techniques can depend on the genre of the original text, the type, the purpose, and the method of the translation. Now, as a result, researchers claim that the translation technique has to have the following 5 basic characteristics. The first is they affect the result of the translation. The second is they are classified by comparison with the original text. The third, they affect microunits of the text. Fourth, they are by nature discursive and contextual. And finally, they are functional. Now, when we are looking at translation techniques and strategies, we can say that the prominent theorists Vinay and Darbonet, they have claimed that they have written a book. They are the early pioneers in the area of translation studies, and they have written a book which was written originally in French and published in 1958, which 4 decades later was published into English. This book is called The Comparative Stylistics of French and English, a Methodology for Translation. Now, these authors, they divided their book into the following 3 sections, which were based on the levels of usage in discourse, which are lexis, collocation, and message. Now, based on these 3 levels, these researchers defined 7 procedures which can be called as translation techniques. And however, these procedures were also classified to be as literal, direct, or oblique translation. Now, what these scholars mean by literal translation is that literal translation occurs when there is an exact structural, lexical, or morphological equivalence between the 2 languages. And for literal translation, they have offered the procedures such as borrowing. Now, in borrowing, there is a word, you have to take the word from the source language and you have to maintain it in the target language. Now, it can be considered as the simplest of the procedures, and it tend to be employed in 2 situations, either when there is a technical process or when there is no term at all existing in the target language. So we can also use borrowing when you want to give a specific stylistic effect in the target language text. Now, for example, in English there is the word weekend. In Turkish we have the word-to-word translation, which is hafta sonu, or you can have if you want to add some flavor to the text, okay, you can use, for example, the words glasnost or perestroika. You can take it as the same and put it into the Turkish text. Another technique is called calque. Now, calque is when an expression from the source text is transferred into the target text. Now, these calques can either follow the syntax of the target language, or they can maintain the syntax of the source language. For example, in English we have the word honeymoon. In Turkish we have balayı, okay, while we are following the syntax, okay. For example, there was the word skyscraper in English, and in Turkish it's translated as gökdelen, okay. So here we are trying to render the same the same syntactical structure in the word. Another one is, again, literal translation, but in terms of word-for-word translation. Now, here, this word-for-word translation is more difficult from English to Turkish because of the word order, the subject, verb, or object order. There is a difference in the grammatical structures because of the 2, based on the 2 language families, and therefore, so generally when we are translating from English to Turkish, if you are translating word for word, you would generally come up with nonsense or no meaning at all. Another technique would be transposition. Now, transposition is used when there is oblique translation. Now, oblique translation is when there is no possibility for word-for-word translation, and the translator has to find a solution to get the meaning across to the target text reader. And when we are talking about transposition, we are talking about changing the word class without changing the meaning. This refers to when translators change the word type from example nouns to verbs, Or transposition can be either obligatory, or it can be optional, and it can be referred to the source text as the base expression and the target text as the transposed expression. For example, if in English we have the sentence, the economy of the country grew steadily, if we were translating this into Turkish, we can use transposition by saying that ülkenin ekonomisi gelişmeye devam etti. Instead of saying grew steadily, we're saying that it's continuing to develop in a way. Another technique is called modulation. Now, modulation refers to the rendering of the target text from a different point of view to that of the source text. Now, in this procedure, it's necessary. This procedure is necessary when the results of the former procedures would produce an awkward sounding translation. So, despite its being grammatically, syntactically, and lexically correct, modulation is a way for the translator to find a naturalness to the target text without sacrificing the meaning or the accuracy, without originating from the source text. Now, for example, in the English, every year I donate a pint of blood. So here we have a pint of blood, but in Turkish we would probably say ünite. Her yıl bir ünite kan bağışlarım. This would be an example where we are trying to get the meaning which is more acceptable in the Turkish language. Another technique is equivalence. Now, when we are talking about equivalence, it's both. It can be simple and it can be complex in translation studies. Now, equivalence is something which is almost inherently cultural. For example, onomatopoeia words, where you would be translating, for example, I don't know, woof woof to hav hav in Turkish, or meow in English into meow in Turkish. And equivalence is also used especially for idioms, idiomatic expressions where all the lexical and the grammatical elements are there, but translating it literally would have the reader confused. You would have something very nonsense. For example, if you in the English idiom, it's raining cats and dogs. We cannot say işte kedi köpek yağıyor. Okay, instead of that we would say işte bardaktan boşalırcasına yağmur yağıyor. You have to find the equivalent. Another technique is adaptation. Now, when we are talking about adaptation, we are talking something which is close to equivalence in a way that the translator seeks to find, to render the source language into the target language. But, however, it has to be relevant and meaningful as the original was. So here we have to imagine that the source text mentions something that was undeniably English, and that translating it into Turkish would have absolutely no meaning, or vice versa. So at this point we would have to use adaptation. For example, when we are talking about the rundown areas of cities where there are people living with low income, while in English this can be called quarters. For example, in Turkish we can say gecekondu. This would literally mean houses which were unofficially built overnight, and it would render approximately the meaning of quarters. Now, we also have other techniques in translation, other processes. For example, compensation is another technique which is most often used by translators. Now, here compensation is used when an item in the source text cannot be reproduced in the target text. Therefore, we have to find something which would compensate for that meaning. For example, last night we ate fish and chips. So how would we say this? Since we don't have such a term in Turkish, perhaps we could say dün akşam patates kızartması yedik as a solution to compensate for that lack of meaning. Another technique is amplification and reduction. Now, amplification, to amplify, this means when the translator provides the target text audience more information in order to be able to understand, in order to be able to comprehend the translated text. So these can be, while this can be in paraphrases, this can also be in the forms of footnotes or even appendixes at the back, or it can be translator's notes. While we are amplifying, the translator also has the chance to reduce what is in the source text. This reduction is when the translator decides to omit some information. Now, omit the information to the target text reader. Reasons which can be underlying this can be due to the fact that the translator decides that the specific information, the certain information could be unnecessary or it will not make sense to the target text reader. So the translator has this choice also. Other techniques are diffusion and condensation. Diffusion, here, while the main difference between diffusion and condensation when it is compared to amplification and reduction is that here the information can be presented in longer or shorter forms. For example, diffusion is when, for example, the original text in the English language, for example, is in 1,000 words. After the translation, if you count the words after the translation, the translated text into Turkish, you would come up with, for example, 1,200 words. Or this can be vice versa. It depends on the language here, mostly. And then we also have other techniques such as logical derivation. Here, the translator tries to give the meaning by trying to find something which is rational, which is logical. For example, with the thrust of the blade, he was set free. In English, we could probably say the thrust of the blade. Now, we know that the blade is something sharp, but we're not sure what it is. So in Turkish, we have to derive something. It could be a knife, it could be a sword. So we could here perhaps say bir kılıç darbesiyle serbest kaldı. Okay, so blade, it's not specific in English whether it's a sword but we know it's something sharp with a sharp edge. So, for example, if the translator says sword, then he would be using logical derivation. And another technique is concretization. To be concrete, okay. Here, the translator goes from the abstract to the concrete. For example, did you have your meal? Here we are not sure whether it was breakfast, it was lunch, or it could be dinner. Okay. So when we are translating, if the translator says akşam yemeğini yedin mi, then here meal would be concretized in Turkish, meaning dinner. Okay. So most often when there is ambiguity as such, translators do adhere to such techniques. Another technique is antonymic translation. here we are using the opposite. We are translating the opposite meaning. For example, the woman on the end of the other phone, the woman on the other end asked him to hang on. Okay, so here if we translate this is as telefonun diğer ucundaki kadın ona telefonu kapatmamasını söyledi. So we would be instead of saying hang on, yani hatta kalması, hanging on, we are saying in Turkish not to put the phone down. Okay, so we would be using antonymic translation here. Now, a brief look at these translation techniques tells us, as you can see, it tells us that these techniques and strategies are employed depending on the aim of the translator. So here we must be aware that the aim of the translator, while it depends on what the translator is trying to get across to the reader, is it the meaning or is it the context? This is an important decision which needs to be made by the translator. So as a result, as you can see, so when we are translating, when we are trying to recode from one language to the other language, there are many options depending on the function of the text and the aim, the particular context also, and the aim of the translator. Okay. I was only able to provide a few examples. I hope that you had enjoyed this session, and I aim to, there are more examples in my paper. If you are able to read the paper, I'll be very happy. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. You can email me, İlknur.p at uludag.edu.tr. And thank you very much for joining. Hope to see you again. Thank you.